Ever wonder what happens when the brightest spotlight meets the deepest whisper of the soul? Picture Angelina Jolie, Hollywood icon and humanitarian powerhouse, pausing mid-stride to ask a question that changes everything. Stay with me because the answer rewrites fame, faith, and family in ways you'd never expect. There's a moment in every person's life, one that doesn't come with fanfare or flashing lights, when something shifts, deeply and permanently. For Angelina Jolie, that moment didn't happen on a film set or at an awards show. It happened in the quiet, in the space between roles, between expectations, between the versions of herself that the world projected onto her. It was in that sacred stillness where she began to ask herself different questions, not who am I to the world, but who am I when no one is watching? And even more tenderly, what if the voice guiding me now isn't my own at all, but something older, something divine? That question didn't have a dramatic origin. It began, as most spiritual shifts do, in the form of curiosity, late nights spent reading, visits to conflict zones, where she didn't just witness human suffering but something even more profound, resilience, often shaped by faith. She would watch mothers in hijab soothing children under tarpaulin tents, whispering prayers as if they were lullabies. She would see people bowing in prayer amidst rubble, their dignity intact, their hope somehow undiminished. She didn't know it then, but these encounters were planting seeds. Angelina has always been drawn to depth, whether through her humanitarian work or her role as a mother to children from multiple cultures and religions. She's lived at the intersection of the personal and the global. But Islam wasn't something she sought as an answer. It came gently, slowly, like mist creeping into a room. It came in the form of listening to stories, to recitations, to callings that seemed faint at first, and then undeniable. It came in moments of stillness, when she was alone, and finally quiet enough to hear her own heart beat in harmony with something bigger. She said it wasn't a single night that changed everything, but rather a series of internal whispers that became too loud to ignore. She began reading the Quran, not as a scholar or theologian, but as a seeker. What struck her wasn't dogma, but depth, the repetition of God's mercy, the centering of intention, the radical beauty of surrender, not in weakness, but in clarity. The idea that every action began with Bismillah, in the name of God, wasn't oppressive to her. It was freeing. It made life sacred in its smallness, a sip of water, a breath, a glance toward the sky. And then came the turning point, not public, not performative, a private moment in her home. The kids were asleep, the world was quiet. She'd been up reading, listening, feeling, and then she simply said the words, Ashadu an la ilaha illa Allah, wa ashadu anna Muhammadan, Rasul Allah, a declaration not just of belief, but of belonging. It was a moment as soft as breath, but as seismic as an earthquake. She didn't post about it. She didn't call the press. It wasn't for show. In fact, for weeks afterward, she held it inside her like a sacred ember. She didn't change overnight. She didn't dress differently the next day, or start praying in public. What she did was more internal, more honest. She began changing how she spoke to herself. She became more mindful of her intentions. She started noticing her tone, her choices, the energy she carried into her home, her work, her thoughts. It wasn't about adopting a new identity. It was about uncovering something that had always been quietly waiting beneath the noise. She began to understand that faith, in this form, didn't demand perfection. It invited presence. It allowed doubt. It welcomed every part of her, not in spite of her past, but in the full context of it. Recentering purpose is not simply about changing the compass needle. It is about discovering that the entire map has been redrawn in richer, more luminous ink. For Angelina Jolie, the adoption of an Islamic worldview did not replace her decades-long humanitarian mission so much as it illuminated it from a new angle, turning familiar commitments into living verses of compassion, justice, and humility. Long before she ever spoke the Shahada, Angelina's passport filled with the stamps of war-torn capitals and refugee camps, each journey propelled by a burning conviction that suffering anywhere diminishes us all. Yet even in the thick of tireless advocacy and logistics, she sometimes felt a hollow space, an ache for a framework that could hold both the enormity of global pain and the fragility of individual hope. Islam entered that hollow like dawn light creeping through broken walls, revealing that her fierce activism and motherhood were already threads in a much wider tapestry called Rahma, mercy. In Islamic tradition, mercy is not sentimental, it is structural. The Quran names God Al-Rahman and Al-Rahman, the entirely merciful, the especially merciful, before every chapter, reminding believers that compassion is the axis upon which the universe turns. When Angelina encountered that repetition, she felt a profound exhale. Her work with refugees, her lobbying for international legal reform, her insistence on telling the stories of the displaced, these were not sporadic acts of charity, they were potential manifestations of God's own attribute, invitations to mirror divine tenderness in policy meetings, field briefings, and film scripts. Suddenly, the bureaucracy of the United Nations, the swirl of translators and security details, the exhaustion after a 16-hour day on scorched terrain, none of it was mere workplace fatigue. It became worship in motion, worship on call. That paradigm shift also recalibrated her understanding of justice. Islam frames justice as a sacred trust, extending beyond courtroom verdicts to the marketplace, the household, the invisible chambers of the heart. Angelina had long campaigned against sexual violence in conflict zones, urging governments to prosecute perpetrators and support survivors. Through her new lens, she saw those efforts as more than humanistic obligations. They were acts of adl, the Quranic command to stand firmly for fairness even if it is against oneself. The verse resonated so deeply that she hand-wrote it on the first page of her field notebook, a reminder that advocacy is not optional heroism, but a covenant between the powerful and the powerless, witnessed by the divine. Humility, too, found fresh soil. Celebrity culture often props a person on pedestals so high that their real view of humanity is obstructed. The rituals of Islam brought Angelina down to the intimate ground. Ablution, cool water over hands, face, feet, became a sensory lesson in equality, the same practice shared by a villager in Bangladesh and a tech executive in Dubai. In the refugee camps where she once arrived as a high-profile envoy, she now joined lines for communal prayer, shoulder to shoulder with women who owned nothing but resilience. She realized that when foreheads meet earth in sujood, titles evaporate, only human clay remains. That tactile humility infused her policy-making meetings as well. Where she once might have opened with statistics and accolades, she now began with stories, with names, with the Quranic conviction that to save one life is to save all of humanity, grounding every negotiation in sacred stakes. And then came the quiet revolution in language. Arabic phrases like inshallah and alhamdulillah slipped into her correspondence, not as slogans but as living acknowledgments of contingency and gratitude. When discussing donor budgets, she'd say, "We can meet that target, inshallah," a subtle alert to colleagues that success is sought, not seized. In debriefings after arduous missions, instead of triumphant self-congratulation, she offered alhamdulillah for safe returns and small victories. These words re-centered the credit away from individual brilliance toward collective grace, shifting workplace culture in ways too gentle for memos, yet powerful enough to soften hardened egos. Motherhood, always her North Star, was likewise reframed. Teaching her children charity had once meant accompanying her on site visits. Now it included nightly reflections on intention. Remember, she tells them, why we give matters as much as what we give. Together they assemble hygiene kits for refugee girls, and before sealing each box they pause. Bismillah, may this reach the one who needs it most. Those pauses seed spiritual mindfulness in practical service, weaving theology into cardboard and toothpaste tubes. Critically, Embracing an Islamic purpose did not narrow her globalism, it expanded it. The Muslim world spans continents, cultures and cuisines, offering her fresh partnerships from West African women's co-ops rebuilding after Boko Haram to Pacific Island communities combating climate migration. She felt part of an ummah, a worldwide family, where her Bosnian goddaughter and her Syrian sister in service were connected not just through her, but through shared invocation of peace upon the Prophet, a collective pulse that transcends time zones and passport colors. Recentering purpose also recalibrated rest. Islam prescribes balance 6 days of exertion, but one of dedicated serenity in Jumu'ah prayer, 5 daily interruptions to realign the soul. For a woman who once prided herself on relentless motion, scheduling pauses felt radical. Yet she discovered that the rhythm of Salah did not fracture her productivity, it refined it, carving islands of stillness inside thundering schedules, allowing clarity to surface where clutter once prevailed. She began structuring field visits around prayer windows, finding that briefing notes written after Dur carried more coherence, that policy drafts finalized after Maghrib bore the warmth of reflection rather than the cold of fatigue. Financially, her purpose matured too. Zakat, the obligatory alms, turned philanthropy from spontaneous generosity into systematic justice. She restructured her charitable foundation so a fixed percentage of earnings flowed automatically to vetted grassroots networks, ensuring that giving was not reactive but ritual, as integral as paying taxes yet carried out with intention and respect. Beyond monetary aid, the spirit of zakat prompted her to inventory her privileges, platform, storytelling skill, diplomatic access. Each privilege became a trust she was obliged to redistribute, whether by amplifying a survivor's testimony on a prime-time interview or mentoring a young filmmaker from a marginalized community who could one day tell her own people's stories from the inside. Family is where theory turns into breakfast conversations, where lofty creeds meet spilled cereal and mismatched socks. For Angelina Jolie, motherhood has always been the crucible in which her beliefs are tested, refined, sometimes dismantled, then rebuilt with sturdier compassion. When she embraced Islam, the first terrain she surveyed was not public opinion, but her own living room. 6 children whose ages span continents of curiosity, each carrying a mosaic of prior religious influences. There were Sunday school memories, Buddhist bedtime chants, and the gentle atheism that comes from kids who have slept under more skies than they can count. Introducing new spiritual practices could have felt like dropping a foreign language into a multilingual household already buzzing with accents. Instead, she approached it as a collaborative art project, guided by a principle she found in the Prophet's advice: speak to people in a way they can understand. The earliest conversations unfolded at night, when the house had settled into hush, and she moved from room to room tucking blankets around shoulders. One child asked bluntly if becoming Muslim meant they could no longer decorate a Christmas tree. Another worried aloud that friends at school might tease. Angelina knelt eye level, explaining that Islam recognizes Jesus as a revered prophet, therefore honoring his birth with lights and kindness was not forbidden. She assured them that faith, at its healthiest, doesn't sever memories, it prunes them so new growth can flourish. In those intimate dialogues, she reframed religious practice as an expansion, not a contraction, of their family's already kaleidoscopic culture. Daily routines absorbed the new rhythm almost imperceptibly at first. The call to prayer became a gentle chime on her phone, not a command but an invitation: pause, breathe, recalibrate. Sometimes the children joined, sometimes they did homework nearby, hearing the soft murmur of Arabic, the way one might absorb a lullaby in a language not yet understood. Gradually the movements of Salah, standing, bowing, prostrating, became familiar choreography. One daughter likened it to yoga with a conversation attached. A teenage son noticed how the sujood posture felt like surrender without defeat, forehead to ground yet spirit unbroken. Angelina allowed their metaphors to stand, believing that faith takes root more deeply when watered by personal meaning, rather than enforced uniformity. Food customs brought tactile excitement. The kids were already accustomed to global cuisines, but halal guidelines sparked scavenger hunt energy during grocery trips. They flipped labels, learning the difference between gelatin sources, discovering plant-based alternatives, giggling at the idea that marshmallows had ethical identities. Ramadan loomed largest on the calendar, a month the younger ones first approached with trepidation. Would fasting turn mom cranky? Would family dinners shift from spontaneous to strictly after-sunset affairs? Angelina turned preparation into storytelling, describing Ramadan as an empathy simulator, a way millions step into hunger's shoes so generosity can sprint farther afterward. She offered each child age-appropriate participation. The teens attempted full-day fasts under doctor's guidance, while the younger crew adopted kindness fasts, refraining from complaining or gossip until sunset. Evenings in Ramadan transformed the household atmosphere. The pre-dawn suhoor awakened them for moonlit pancakes, a novelty that knit memories in the sleepy gleam of the kitchen. After sunset, the table overflowed with dishes representing every child's heritage: Cambodian soup beside Ethiopian injera, beside Bosnian pita, culinary proof that Islam's reach is borderless. They opened each iftar with dates and water, a ritual so simple it became sacred, reminding them that sweetness is most profound after restraint. Angelina observed how the children's patience stretched across the month. Quarrels shortened, gratitude lengthened, spiritual education unfolded organically, rather than formal madrasa lessons. Angelina turned to storytelling, reading children's versions of Quranic narratives, where prophets wrestled with doubt, siblings betrayed and forgave, women of courage redirected the course of history. She highlighted resonances with tales they already loved, parallels between Joseph's well and otherworldly wardrobes, between Moses' exile and every hero's reluctant call. She emphasized that Islam venerates knowledge, therefore questioning was not rebellion but worship. They kept a family wonder journal, jotting queries. Why does the Quran compare hearts to locks? Do angels feel tired? Each Friday evening they gathered on the rug, drawing questions from a jar, researching answers together, sometimes calling an imam friend for insight, sometimes leaving mysteries intact like stars unsolved but still admired. Angelina noticed shifts in household ethics. The Quranic mandate to speak kindly echoed in sibling debates. When tempers flared over screen time, someone would invoke, "Remember, Allah loves those who restrain anger." Apologies flowed faster, laced with sincerity, rather than grudging civility. Charity discussions became concrete. They allocated a portion of weekly allowance to a family fund, then voted on micro-projects, buying blankets for local shelters, sponsoring a schoolgirl's tuition in Jordan, sending solar lamps to Rohingya camps. Each act was paired with intention, for the sake of God, to ease a stranger's night. Motherhood under this spiritual lens also demanded self-monitoring. Angelina kept a small tasbih in her pocket. Between scenes on a film set or policy calls, she thumbed the beads, repeating Subhanallah, a subtle tether back to equilibrium. The children noticed her increased calm. Where she once might have scolded in fatigue, she now inhaled, offered corrective guidance, then ended with "I love you for the sake of God," a phrase that puzzled them at first, but soon became shorthand for unconditional esteem, tethered to something higher than mood. Holidays blended rather than competed. They still strung Christmas lights, now paired with calligraphy banners for Eid. On Eid mornings, they dressed in colorful attire reflecting each child's birthplace, exchanged small gifts, then cooked a communal meal for neighbors, explaining that celebration grows by sharing. Interfaith friends were invited to gatherings where questions flowed over tea, fostering a culture in which no belief was off limits for respectful curiosity. This openness fortified the children against bigotry. When a classmate once mocked headscarves, a daughter calmly recounted Quranic verses on modesty and dignity, transforming the taunt into a teachable moment. Through it all, Angelina viewed her maternal role as shepherding souls rather than imposing doctrine. She reminded the kids that faith is ultimately between them and their Creator, that her task was to model not mandate. She confessed her own learning curve, sharing moments of confusion or struggle, how Arabic pronunciation sometimes tangled on her tongue, how dawn prayers felt daunting after night shoots. By admitting imperfection, She dismantled the pedestal of parental infallibility, inviting them to witness growth in real time. In doing so, she turned family life into a living madrasa, where everyone from the eldest to the youngest occupied both the seat of the teacher and the cushion of the student. When you stand at the center of Hollywood's revolving door, silence is rarely an option, and stillness is almost a scandal. Angelina Jolie has lived most of her adult life with flashbulbs, pulsing at a tempo that could rival any nightclub's strobe, her name flung across scrolling tickers whenever she so much as changes a hairstyle. The tabloids thrive on building storms, and for years she learned to navigate them with the wary skill of a sailor who studies clouds as if they were written in Morse code. Yet the moment she privately embraced Islam, the climate around her seemed to mutate from a mere weather pattern into a full-blown monsoon. Headlines suddenly doubled as verdicts: Hollywood rebel converts, secret Muslim agenda, will she force hijabs on her kids? Each question mark carried the weight of an accusation disguised as curiosity. What made this particular maelstrom more intense was the clash between two rhythms, one frenetic and external, the other hushed and interior. Prayer, by design, interrupts worldly motion. 5 times a day, the believer enters a sanctuary of deliberate slowness, aligning body, breath and soul. The adhan does not shout in capital letters, it rings like a distant bell calling ships toward harbor. Angelina found that each time she stepped onto the prayer rug, she was effectively walking off the stage of public scrutiny, closing the curtain on gossip columns that measured her worth in micro-controversies. Yet the moment she folded her prayer mat, the world roared back to life, demanding statements, clarifications, defenses. Early on, her publicists urged a proactive strategy: stage a photo op outside a mosque, give a glossy magazine an exclusive interview, script a tidy narrative. But spiritual stillness teaches an alternate logic, that authenticity cannot be choreographed for press cycles. Angelina chose instead a posture of dignified minimalism, brief confirmations when necessary, gentle refusals when baited, no comment deployed not as evasion but as boundary. While pundits interpreted her restraint as secrecy, she recognized it as sabr, patience. In Islamic tradition, patience is not passive, it is an active, tensile strength that insists on truth unfolding in God's timing, not the 24-hour news loop. That decision, however, carried costs. Paparazzi lenses grew more invasive, trying to capture her emerging rituals: a snapshot of her leaving an Islamic bookstore, a zoomed shot of a tasbih peeking from her handbag, speculative commentary whenever she donned a loosely draped scarf. Some outlets superimposed fabricated quotes over grainy images, attributing to her political stances she had never voiced. Online comment sections mutated into battlegrounds of Islamophobic slurs and fervent defenses. Colleagues, who once chatted breezily about script revisions, now tiptoed, unsure how to greet her during Ramadan lunches, worrying they might offend by eating. The maelstrom was equal parts noise and nervous silence. Yet within that chaos, Angelina discovered that spiritual stillness is not merely the absence of sound, it is a tuning fork that teaches discernment between essential and expendable frequencies. She began treating interviews like acts of conscious speech, measuring words against the prophetic ethic: speak good or remain silent. If a journalist sought salacious angles, she redirected to substance: stories of refugee resilience, legal reforms for stateless children, the Quranic injunction to stand for justice. If a talk show host pressed on whether she would veil full-time, she answered with context, citing the spectrum of modesty across Muslim cultures, and steering the conversation back to agency. Paradoxically, the calmer her voice, the louder the impact. Ratings spiked not because she fed controversies, but because audiences sensed the gravity of a woman who refused to be typecast, either as Hollywood icon or religious symbol. Behind the scenes, stillness manifested in micro-rituals that acted as emotional storm shelters. On set, between takes, she kept a small prayer journal, jotting dhikr phrases: Yo Latif, O Gentle One, repeating them until adrenaline subsided. During red-eye flights to humanitarian hotspots, she listened to Quranic recitations through noise-canceling headphones, letting verses weave a cocoon against tabloid chatter. Her trailer became a makeshift meditation corner, a portable prayer rug, a spray bottle for ablution, and a strand of prayer beads replaced the usual clutter of celebrity perks. Crew members noticed her newfound composure. She handled scheduling mishaps with an equanimity that diffused tension faster than any producer's pep talk. Spiritual stillness also reframed her relationship with digital spaces. Social media, once an occasional megaphone for advocacy, now felt like a potential fissure where serenity might leak. She delegated account management, limiting her own screen time to purposeful updates, fundraising links, crisis alerts, gratitude notes after successful missions. The dopamine drip of likes and retweets was replaced by the subtler satisfaction of dua, made in anonymity. She discovered that invisibility could be a gift. Deeds done away from cameras tasted sweeter, resonated longer in the chambers of conscience. Crucially, embracing stillness did not mean retreating from public life. Instead, it became the ballast that allowed her to navigate it more bravely. She accepted invitations to panels on religious freedom, using her platform to dismantle stereotypes wielded against Muslims worldwide. She produced documentaries highlighting pluralistic Muslim histories, stories of scientists, poets and architects, whose legacies scaffolded modern civilization. Each project, however public, was anchored in nights of private reflection where she asked, is this service or vanity? Whose dignity does it uplift? Does it echo the Quranic call to be a people who bring benefit? The answers dictated green lights or graceful surrenders of opportunities that glittered but did not glow with purpose. Family life remained a barometer. Whenever media storms threatened to spill into the household, she convened circle time, a practice borrowed from trauma counseling. Phones off, candles lit, every child voiced anxieties, while she listened without interruption, modeling prophetic listening. They discussed how public perception can distort truth, how Islam positions intention above image, how resilience is built by anchoring in values rather than validation. The children learned that stillness is portable. It travels in the breath, accessible whether backstage at the Oscars or queuing for passports at border control. Angelina Jolie's journey into Islam was never about adopting a new identity. It was about returning to a deeper, truer version of herself that had been buried beneath decades of performance, projection, and public expectation. Reclaiming identity, in her case, was not a reinvention but a recentering. For years, she had been hailed as everything from Hollywood's wild child to global humanitarian icon. Her face had become synonymous with causes, characters, and controversies, yet in moments of stillness, she often questioned how much of her public self was a costume stitched together by other people's narratives. Islam, with its emphasis on inner purification and sincere intention, provided her the tools, and more importantly the permission to peel back those layers. She once described prayer as a place where I am finally just a soul, no accolades, no accusations, no camera angles. In sujood, the posture of prostration where the forehead touches the earth, she found a radical kind of humility, one that didn't strip her of power but returned her to its source. For someone whose life had been spent navigating red carpets, where every inch of posture was a statement, this act of deliberate surrender became a revolutionary declaration of identity. It told her, you are more than the applause, more than the roles, more than even the good you've done in the world. You are seen by the one who knows the secrets of your heart. That idea changed everything. She began to reconstruct her sense of self, not around opinions of people but around values rooted in the Quran. Justice, mercy, patience, modesty, truthfulness and compassion. These weren't abstract ideals but daily checkpoints. Was she speaking with grace? Was she giving others the benefit of the doubt? Was she checking her ego before entering a conversation? These weren't questions posed by a manager or coach, but the inner prompts of a spiritual system designed to polish the soul. And in those quiet assessments, she began to feel more whole, not because she had reached some final version of herself, but because she was now operating from a place of intentional authenticity. Islam also offered her a new kind of relationship with femininity. Hollywood had taught her that beauty was currency, that femininity was often weaponized, either used against you or used by you. But Islamic teachings around modesty, dignity, and self-respect reframed those notions entirely. She began to see modesty, not as repression but as reclamation, the power to decide how much of herself the world had access to. It was no longer about hiding, but about honoring. Whether it was covering her hair on certain days, or dressing more conservatively, these choices were not made for applause or approval. They were quiet acts of resistance against a culture that constantly demanded visibility on its terms. This reorientation also affected how she viewed her own story. The chapters of her life that had once been cloaked in shame or scandal, early struggles with mental health, tumultuous relationships, controversial choices, were now reinterpreted through a lens of divine mercy. Islam taught her that no mistake is too large for forgiveness, and that every hardship carries a lesson and a path toward redemption. The story was not over. In fact, it had barely begun. She started journaling more intentionally, not to record events, but to capture spiritual growth, the way a verse hit differently on a difficult day, how fasting made her more mindful of her words, how charity shifted her sense of abundance. Even in her professional world, this reclaimed identity began to leave fingerprints. She became more selective about roles, more deliberate about the stories she lent her voice to. Scripts that centered vengeance or vanity lost their appeal. She was drawn instead to narratives of redemption, resilience, and spiritual awakening, not because they mirrored her journey perfectly, but because they offered audiences a glimpse into the kinds of transformations she now understood from the inside. She met with directors and producers, and began pushing for more authentic representation of Muslim characters, not as monoliths or political props, but as layered, flawed, beautiful human beings. Behind closed doors, she challenged stereotypes not with lectures, but with lived truth. Relationships shifted too. Some friends distanced themselves, uncertain or uncomfortable with the changes they saw. Others leaned in, curious, humbled, even inspired, but through it all, she learned to stop defining herself by others' proximity. Her worth was no longer measured by who stayed or left. It was measured by her own sincerity before her Creator. And in this redefinition, she finally understood something she'd sensed all along, that identity is not what the world projects onto you, it's what you protect, nourish, and return to when the noise fades. Reclaiming her identity through Islam was not a single moment, but a mosaic of choices, practices, and awakenings. It was found in the whispered verses, during tahajjud prayers in the still of night, in the cracked palms held open during times of confusion, in the glances in the mirror that no longer asked, "Do they like me?" but instead asked, "Am I walking in truth?" It was in every small surrender that built toward a sovereignty the world could never give, and therefore could never take away. When we trace the arc of Angelina Jolie's story, from the solitary epiphany that opened her to Islam, through the renewed sense of purpose guiding her activism, into the tender crucible of motherhood, the whirlwind of media scrutiny, and finally, the reclamation of a truer self, we witness a narrative of intentional becoming. It is the tale of a woman who chose stillness over spectacle, humility over hype, and authenticity over applause. Each keynote reveals that her conversion was never about abandoning a former life, but about bathing every dimension of it, career, family, advocacy, even celebrity, in the clarifying light of faith. In doing so, she models a universal lesson: real transformation is not a public performance, but an inward pilgrimage that quietly rewrites every outward step. Whether you meet this story on a red carpet, in a refugee camp, or within the hush of your own living room, its invitation is the same. Listen for the whisper beneath the noise, align your actions with mercy, and let the truth of who you are lead the way.